In progress.
On Herb Gestalter, who lives on Gull Pond, John Dwayne, myself, Laura Hewitt, who lives on Long Pond, and the one member who has not yet showed up is Tom Slack, who also lives on a pond, but it's up in Vermont. I think we can start the meeting, and Tom will join us as soon as he can. We in Wellfleet treasure our ponds and think they're in pretty good shape with very rare cyanobacteria issues. The purpose of this meeting is to see what we need to do to keep it that way. What we might need to do for testing, what we might need to do as an action plan. I know APCC has played a very important role in this area, so we look forward to the discussion. I had suggested that both, since they live on the ponds, Lauren and Herb are the leaders in the discussion. So I'll turn it over to Herb now and then open the floor.
No, thank you all. Diane, nice to meet you finally. Andrew, nice to see you again.
See you, Herb.
Thanks.
Likewise.
Yes. Just a quick background. There are numerous ponds in Wellfleet, as there are every place in most towns in Cape Cod. There are 8 ponds where APCC did the cyanobacteria testing this past year. They're basically all the ponds that have either a national park beach or a town beach, one access point, one size or the other. But they vary, again, like in every other town, they vary greatly in size and in use. So one thing we're having to keep in mind is that when developing a pond management plan, it's not going to be one plan that fits all the ponds. We're going to have to tailor make it to or apply it to different ponds in different ways because they are significantly different. We've been working at this for a while, and what we're really hoping to do this morning is pick your brains, you who work in many more ponds and have knowledge of many more ponds than we do, on some of the basic issues that we're addressing in studying the ponds. That's why I had sent out, Laura and I had come up with a series of questions or subjects that kind of drive the information we need. And I had sent that out to everybody a couple times. I sent it last on November 8th, I think it was. It's an email. And I'll quickly go through the subjects we'd like to talk to you about today, and then we can go through them in detail. It's pond nutrient loading. What's the relative importance of the different sources of nutrients? That's one subject. Septic systems. I'm very encouraged by the new septic systems that are being developed, but we want to get your feedback on them. What are the critical elements we need to follow in tracking the health of the ponds? And What's the frequency of testing of the above? What are the most common and dangerous invasive plants? And then finally, are there any sources of funding for pond monitoring? As you may also know, the National Seashore has monitored some of the ponds in Wellfleet intensely. And there is data, at least on the Gull Pond chain, going back to the 1980s, which the Seashore has. And as they did a pretty good dump for me in my Glupaka hat about 6-7 years ago of oxygen, temperature, clarity of the water. And they are now reviewing the databases, but they hope in a year to make those public again. But if we can jump into this, can we talk about the relative importance of the sources of nutrients coming into the pond? And by that, we talk about what's the relative importance of runoff from banks? What's the importance of septic level groundwater flow? What's the importance of deeper level groundwater flow? What's the importance of animal and land animals, fowls? We have an awful lot of gulls in some of the ponds. And rain. So can we start with that? What's your take on the importance of nutrients coming from runoff, kind of as opposed to underground water flow into the ponds?
Can I just maybe, before I turn it over to Joanne, maybe just try and frame the discussion a little bit around this particular topic. And I'll just start off by saying that we have a really good sense on the estuarine side about the relative import and influence of the different types of sources of nutrients, because we have a lot of data across a wide range of estuaries over a long period of time. The whole lake conversation is handicapped to a degree by the relatively poor data set with which we have to work. And so I think that we have some general impressions about that, but it's not as backed up perhaps as the estuary side, where everybody feels relatively confident that across the region 80-85% of the controllable nitrogen load is septic. How that plays out in the freshwater environment, we're going to learn more, but and I'll let Joanne jump in. My general sense is that septic still drives the bus, but the relative import of stormwater and land side fertilizer applications may be a little bit more. And one thing to think about is the relative difference between sort of base loading and event type loading, and that they can both have an influence on water quality. Ponds may be a little bit more susceptible to heavy rain events, washing a lot of fertilizers off the land side into the pond, and might create a circumstance where you can get a short-term bloom because conditions were right and you fed the pond. And that you don't necessarily, so in the grand scheme of things, it still may be a minority source, but it can have a very significant impact in a particular event on a particular week. So I just wanted to just frame that a little bit, my general impression, but turn it over to Joanne to speak to some of the issues based on a more objective review.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to share my screen shortly, but I want to reiterate what Andrew said about the relative lack of pond water quality data for Wellfleet and the Cape as a whole. And so what I'm going to show you is some information from the Massachusetts Estuaries Project study for the Wellfleet Harbor watershed, which actually includes most of Wellfleet and a good many of the ponds. And we're assuming that most of the ponds, if not all of the ponds in Wellfleet, are connected to groundwater and fed by groundwater. So I'm going to share my screen. This worked before. So you had framed some questions. What is the relative importance of sources of nutrients? Runoff, septic systems and groundwater, deeper groundwater flow, animals and land animals, and rainfall. And to sort of back up to a big picture, looking at the Wellfleet Harbor watershed, the Massachusetts Estuary Project report found that the controllable watershed nitrogen loading to Wellfleet Harbor consists of 82% from septic systems, this is nitrogen, 8% from stormwater runoff, and 8% from fertilized areas. That accounts for pretty much all of the controllable watershed nitrogen loading. And controllable means those sources of nitrogen that we can control through our wastewater management and stormwater management and fertilization practices for lawns and golf courses or lack of fertilization. The non-controllable watershed nitrogen sources are nitrogen loading to natural areas of the watershed and nitrogen loading to water surfaces of the watershed. And I'm not sure that we really want to delve into it, but I can make this available after the meeting. This is from the MEP report, the watershed nitrogen loads from different sources. And as they say in the first sentence, sorry, that I've highlighted in red, actually, land use and wastewater analysis found that generally 82% of the controllable watershed nitrogen load to the embayment was from wastewater and 8% from impervious surfaces, that means stormwater runoff, and 8% from fertilized areas. And so that's the takeaway. And for the details in terms of atmospheric deposition, nitrogen from benthic sources, that is sediments, land uses, and so on and so forth, I think you can refer to the table. If you compare this with what the Cape is seeing as a whole, the Cape Cod Commission's 208 Cape Cod Watershed Water Quality Plan for Cape Cod summarized nitrogen sources for the Cape as a whole. For controllable nitrogen, 78% comes from septic systems, 9% from fertilizers, and 8% from stormwater. And then since you had questions about the contributions from animals, they looked at farm animals. They found that Cape-wide, 0.3% of the controllable nitrogen came from farm animals. So it's a very, very small percentage from farm animals. I think the question you have about wildlife, probably that nitrogen loading is contained in the watershed load from natural surfaces and or water nitrogen loading to water bodies, because that's where it would have been taken into account. So I don't believe the MEP study looks at the contribution of waterfowl per se. It's a common question, but it's contained in that nitrogen loading to natural surfaces, including water. But of the sources that we can control, septic systems, stormwater, and fertilized areas, most, all of it comes from septic systems. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it's very helpful. In fact, 5 of the 8 ponds in Wellfleet are outside the estuary boundaries.
Okay,
And
So,
it's-
the other thing to think about here, is that, while the nitrogen is an important feature, especially around cyano growth, we're also talking a lot of the water quality problems in the ponds driven by phosphorus. And, there is not that Cape-wide measure yet in a lot of the freshwater systems of the relative sources of phosphorus, but even though they move through the groundwater differently, I think the proportionality of some of this is probably likely to hold. So, it's just the nitrogen thing, we're all been trained for a lot of good reason to think, septic equals nitrogen equals water quality problems. And you just have to expand that equation to include the phosphorus piece. The big difference is
right.
that the nitrogen is highly water soluble, flows out of your effluent into the groundwater through your septic or cesspool or whatever you might have, and moves to the nearest discharging water body. Phosphorus, has a propensity to bind to the soils. It's far less mobile, but despite some of the historic conventional wisdom that phosphorus doesn't move, it clearly does, because we've got all these phosphorus loaded water bodies. And so, it moves differently. And the way I have come to think about it is, the phosphorus, the soil has a certain ability to absorb phosphorus, and then it's depleted. And then that phosphorus, the next slugs kind of roll over and pass the soils that are have used all their assimilative capacity. So it moves in these kind of chunky waves, so it'll move in the groundwater. And the soil particles will grab enough of the phosphorus. And then once that's full, it spills over. It's like a series of waves cascading along the beach. And so it does move, and it does move more slowly. I was listening to, we did a similar conversation in Mashpee at my board meeting on Monday night. Brian Baumgartner from the county septic test center sort of raised a little bit of a piece I hadn't heard before, basically saying that, like when you put in a new septic system, you replace some of the soils, the fill, it buys you about 2 to 3 years of phosphorus attenuation capability. And then that's exhausted. And then it starts to move off the system and off the site. So just think about the nutrient question a little differently and recognize that, the phosphorus moves and behaves differently as it leaves your septic system than the nitrogen does.
Andrew, are there any publications, articles about the role of phosphorus, particularly in respect to ponds, how it moves, how
Sure.
one could
Yes.
control it?
Sure, there's voluminous writings on those subjects.
Right. I can mention, when you get to the question, I had assumed we would go in order. When you get to the question about critical elements in tracking the health of ponds and the relative importance of nitrogen and phosphorus in ponds, I can answer that question. There's a very good paper from 2009.
Was that the one by Stephen, that the Seashore did, Stephen Smith? And
No,
okay, the Seashore
Yes, I know.
debated this, I think it was in the 90s, actually, which was more important, phosphorus and nitrate. And there's a lot of discussion on that in relationship to the ponds. And there was a paper, which I just have to dig it out of my files, on just this discussion, which was more relevant, which was the
Yes.
tipping point. And
yes.
Yeah.
If you like, we can skip ahead to that question.
I just
about
have
the-
one other question on phosphorus. to clarify what I thought I knew. I thought I understood that one of the problems with phosphorus is it doesn't deteriorate, it doesn't break up. That nitrates will be absorbed and will absorbed by plants and will in effect dissipate from a pond. But once phosphorus is there, it's always there. Is that accurate? That it,
Well,
Let me take a stab at it, Joanne, you can
right,
correct
I
me.
can fill in, right.
I think what you're describing, Herb, is the fact that, and this is different than in the estuary setting. You have phosphorus, it promotes plant growth. That plant growth dies typically in the cold weather season. It then settles back to the bottom and partially decomposes, and it brings with it and becomes a source of organic material and phosphorus. And there's phosphorus in there. And under certain circumstances, that phosphorus load can be released from the sediments back up into the water column, where it then feeds the next succession of algal and plant growth, which then goes through its life cycle, settles back down. And if those circumstances recur that allow it to resuspend, it continues to feed. So it does get consumed, but it's kind of a natural process that rolls it forward year to year to year. It's not necessarily the same atom of phosphorus, being a zombie nutrient, never dying and living again. But it just feeds that pattern.
That's
I do okay, Joanne?
yes, that's a great description of how phosphorus can cycle back and forth between the solid and dissolved forms in the water and the sediments. And so part of the problem is that phosphorus that is accumulated into plant tissues, when those plants die at the end of the season, the remains will sink to the bottom and decompose. And over time, that organic matter builds up in the bottom. This is true for marine and pond systems. And under certain conditions, when ponds, say, become anoxic or low in oxygen at the bottom, and or there isn't enough iron present to bind phosphorus, because that's another factor, the phosphorus can move back into the water column and feed the plants that are living in the pond and also the phytoplankton as well. So there's a sort of a cycle between phosphorus entering the pond in dissolved form, in particular form, and then being taken up by plants, sinking to the bottom in plants and plant debris, becoming stored in the sediments, and then plants taking it up again. Whereas with nitrogen, nitrogen is far more mobile and soluble in water, and it will travel a long distance in water. And what you may be referring to with nitrogen dissipating from a water body is denitrification, whereby nitrate in water through bacterial processes eventually may become converted to nitrogen gas, which escapes into the atmosphere. And when it escapes into the atmosphere, that is that's a good thing for the ponds in terms of nitrogen loading, because it reduces the nitrogen loading in the ponds. If that denitrification process happens when there's low oxygen or no oxygen in a pond or in a marine system. So if you have aerobic, well-oxygenated conditions all throughout the water column, the denitrification might happen only in the sediments, and it might not escape as much to the atmosphere as much as you hope. So that's the route of escape for nitrogen from a water body, is through denitrification processes that lead to the creation of nitrogen gas that escapes upward. And that may or may not be happening all the time. So I don't think we should necessarily rely on denitrification as an escape mechanism.
Sounds like a good
What
move.
I- I'm trying to think ahead eventually to some sort of action plan if one is needed. And what I'm hearing is that we ought to focus a lot on phosphorus because once it's there, it seems not to go away. It gets involved in a cycle, whereas the nitrogen can go away. You want to have a shot at that?
No, I would strongly disagree, and
Okay.
I'm I'm going to tackle that question that I've been dying to get to,
All right,
which is,
go ahead then, please.
yeah, which is what is the relative importance of nitrogen and phosphorus in ponds, leaving aside pH for now. I think this was one of your questions. We feel, and I think the scientific publications bear this out, is that it's important to monitor and consider both phosphorus and nitrogen in freshwater ponds. Conventionally, phosphorus has been considered limiting for ponds and nitrogen has not, but a published study of Cape Cod ponds, Nirfan and Chris Neo and Rich McCorney in 2009, which looked at Cape Cod freshwater coastal plain ponds, show that both nitrogen and phosphorus are needed for plant and algae growth in freshwater bodies. And I've given a link for the abstract, and I think that this is a good solid study that says that basically they found that additions of both nitrogen and phosphorus to ponds and testis systems were necessary in order to spur phytoplankton growth, and overloading it with one or the other didn't result in shifting it to phosphorus limitations. So, and there are some other reasons to consider monitoring nitrogen as well as phosphorus. If you have buildup of ammonia, although it can be short-lived, it's toxic to fish and wildlife. Nitrogen in ponds can be transported from the ponds via streams or groundwater to coastal embayments, which adds to the nitrogen loading in embayments. And that's the nitrogen transport from freshwater systems into Wellfleet Harbor via, say, river systems is included in the MEP study. I don't believe that they specifically pulled out ponds as a source, but it's included in the watershed loading. Monitoring the nitrogen is, along with phosphorus in ponds, is important because ponds might act to, say, dilute or attenuate nitrogen loading to estuaries. Most ponds on Cape Cod are connected hydrologically to groundwater. And so meaning that nitrogen in ponds could enter groundwater and contribute to the groundwater nitrogen loading to embayments, the process that I just described. Nitrogen in groundwater could potentially impact drinking water wells. We found, for example, that last year, Yarmouth had an exceedance of their nitrite drinking water standard, which exceeded the drinking water standard for nitrite, not nitrate, but nitrite is a closely related compound that causes health effects, especially for infants. And finally, towns that are monitoring freshwater ponds, monitoring nutrients, Barnstable, Dennis, Eastham, Falmouth, Harwich, Mashpee, Orleans, and Sandwich, they're all monitoring nitrogen and phosphorus together. It's a generally accepted practice now to monitor both for the reasons that I've mentioned.
How do the towns pay for that monitoring?
It's variable. Some of them are, participating through the estuaries project. And there has been some matching. Some of it is done through partnerships with Buzzards Bay Coalition, Center for Coastal Studies, and UMass Dartmouth tend to be the major monitors out there that's being done. Just want to loop back to one of the points that Joanne made, though, because she's absolutely right that that paper and everything we're seeing about the cyano piece is emphasizing and giving greater weight to the relationship between nitrogen and phosphorus, but that and this becomes especially relevant when we jump to the sort of control tech and management options available to you. The questions play out very differently as it relates to septic technologies and where the state of the science and technology is in controlling one or both of those nutrients. And I want to really put a bug in everybody's ear that we need to not break this call without having a real conversation about the state of septic technology treatment as it relates to phosphorus side, because we need to make sure that especially the focus of this conversation around lake water quality, that we have you walk away with a strong program to manage the phosphorus inputs.
Do you want to jump into the septic systems now? It seems to be a good point to segue into that.
Sure.
John, agree?
Yep.
Yeah, let's go, let's talk about the septic systems.
So, and Joanne, I think you probably had some stuff prepared for this, but let me just, a lot of talk about septic systems.
Yes.
And, it's important, this is a starting point of the conversation, to realize what septic systems were and were not designed to do. A perfectly well-functioning, off-the-shelf Title V septic system does little or nothing for nutrient control. They're not designed to. They are designed to protect humans from exposure to pathogens on the surface. So the objective of them is to get the bacteria associated with broken down human waste into the ground and off the surface, so that you, I, anybody else doesn't come in contact with it. Does great. Combined with our sandy soils, fabulous. What it does at the same time, though, is it takes all that nutrient load from that broken down waste, and it's a very effective conduit of those nutrients into the groundwater. So, we just had this discussion in Mashpee the other night. Everybody's like, it's kind of like Casablanca. People were like professing to be horrified that there were actually cesspools near our ponds. How could this happen? Who knew? And it's like, well, we're going to get them out of there. And I was like, well, time out a minute. You can take the cesspool out, put it in a Title V system. If what you're worried about is nutrients, practically speaking, no difference. And so, that then begs the question about, what do you do about it? So there are experimental and alternative systems under development and at various stages of approval in the septic system world that bring down nitrogen levels and bring down phosphorus levels. The state of the industry is much better developed for nitrogen reduction than it is phosphorus reduction. There isn't out there a system that professes to do both. And that's one of the rubs here. You know, there are a lot of vendors out there spending a lot of time and money going through the approval process to demonstrate reductions in nitrogen output. There are some promising technologies out there that are in the development process that provide significant additional reductions beyond anything that's got general use approval right now. General use approval means that you or I or anybody else can go buy one of these systems, install it without any special additional permissions or requirements for monitoring or evaluation. So on the nitrogen side, you know, a standard system puts out something like 25, 26 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. Most of the generally use approved systems are scored at 19. So an improvement. There are several under evaluation for general use that are showing signs of being able to get down to 10 or slightly below. And so the market seems to be responding in a way that's going to provide septic systems that do provide more significant nitrogen reductions in the foreseeable future. The state of the marketplace for phosphorus is way behind where they are for nitrogen systems. There are a couple of systems out there. There's one from Japan that's particularly got people's eye. There's one of them in Massachusetts. So they're really early stage. So as we talk about septics, they're a big problem. The what do you do about it part, especially as it relates to phosphorus, is not a great answer yet available. So I just wanted to give that as a backdrop. So, you know, and if you all of a sudden tell people they need to have these IA systems, you're going to get, you know, meaningful nitrogen reductions from them. But it leaves you with your phosphorus problem. And so it's at the moment, I think, a part of a solution, a partial solution to your nutrient problem in the freshwaters, but may not be enough to change the trajectory of some of your ponds, depending on what the actual input sources are.
Going back to
Andrew.
what I remember of my chemistry many years ago, I would have thought it'd be easier to deal with phosphorus than nitrogen. Nitrates move. It's very hard to trap them, but phosphates, I would think, would be easier to trap.
You know, the technology approaches that they're using are really different. You know, the nitrogen systems tend to, you know, work on processes to denitrify, not trap them, but denitrify. So additional levels of treatment.
Yep.
The phosphorus systems basically are trying to find ways to introduce molecules into the treatment process that will grab the phosphorus and cause it to settle out into the distribution, into the tank, so that it's not part of the liquid effluent that leaves the tank. So they're approaching it differently, and there's been much more emphasis because of Chesapeake Bay, the Cape, the marine discussions, to push the marketplace to think that there's more gold in the hills of nitrogen control than there is in phosphorus control. So the market just hasn't seen the market signal say it's worth my investment to figure this thing out. And there are a couple that are out there, and the county has some seed money where they're actually subsidizing the retrofitting of existing systems to test some of these phosphorus control systems in homes on Cape Cod. But it's very early stage.
Andrew, can you speak to the effectiveness of siting septic systems further back from ponds as a possible way of controlling phosphorus. For example, I've heard that 300 feet sighting or distance from between a water body and a septic system might help to attenuate the phosphorus.
It buys you time.
It buys you
I
time,
think
right?
that, you know, that notion is, I think predicated on a increasingly outdated assumption that the soils, 300 feet of soil was enough to hold phosphorus forever before it reaches a pond. And I think that, at least from what we're being told in our Mashpee conversations, that just doesn't hold up anymore. Further back is better because it just gives you more assimilative capacity, but it's not inexhaustible. And eventually it gets consumed and you get breakout.
John, can I ask through you a follow-up to Andrew?
Sure, please.
So yeah, the one system you were talking about that removes phosphorus, if this is going to be the new, is it the best path forward for septic systems on the Cape? If that's
Yeah.
what I'm understanding here. What is that one system that's available now?
Oh, there's more than one. I'm just trying to pull up the summary sheet that I got from the county while we talk. I don't have it off the top of my head, but before the conversation's done, I'll find the email.
Okay, so
Oh,
that's
sure,
something
sure.
that would be available. I know that there's funds available for retrofitting if somebody wanted to do that.
It is, John. What you end up in right now is that, so there's there's 3 stages in the, there's 12 stages of recovery. There's three stages in septic approval processes. There's piloting, provisional, and general use. So general use is kind of where, you can put them anywhere. Provisional or piloting is when you first have a technology come to the state and say, I want to be able to use this in Massachusetts. And they say, all right, you got to put 5 of them in the ground somewhere, get some initial data, see how it goes. If it looks promising, we'll give you approval to go to provisional status. The way you get from provisional status to general use is that you have 50 systems in Massachusetts with at least 3 years of data. And that's the data set that, and when you get provisional, it comes with a bunch of conditions. So if you're the homeowner, you buy a provisional system, you're agreeing to have a contract operator who come in and make sure it's functioning for those 3 years. They'll do testing, I think it's monthly, of the effluent so that they can quantify what the performance is. And you have to have sufficient backup capability on your property to put in a conventional system if the provisional system fails. So it's not it costs money, it adds space requirements, so it's not for everybody. So one of the ones, I'll send you the list, one of the ones that you would apply, you might buy, would come with those conditions associated with it. If it all bears out to work the way it's supposed to work and it gets general use, then you don't have to have that backup source, that backup area for a Title V system to replace it. And you may not have to have the contract operator and the monthly sampling. But if it turns out it doesn't work, you might have to install an alternative backward system to the more conventional Title V system. So it comes with risk to the homeowner, which is why, they sent it to me because I expressed some interest in doing it to one of my septic system in my house. And I got to tell you, I looked at the terms and conditions and the cost and what they were willing to subsidize. And even I, who have an interest in this, kind of went, ugh, I'm not sure I want to do that.
I hear you, and that's kind of where I'm going at it. A lot of people want to know about septic, and there's a lot of people like me that have very small lots, and what's in there right now was jammed in so that it could meet the requirements, and there's not going to be room to install a whole other septic system at some other portion on my lot.
Right.
So the simple question is that the system that I have now, you can't retrofit that system. That system wouldn't be able to, one of these provisional trial systems is what I'm hearing, couldn't be put where my current one is now because I need to have a backup in case
Yeah.
it doesn't work. Is that
Yeah,
right?
so it's hard and it depends, depending on what the system is. So like the one that I listen to and go, oh, that might work for me. Is it basically an a probe that's put in that puts iron into the tank with an electric connection to the house. And so just basically the way I in my simple brain envisioned it was, you drop this electrode into the tank and it does its magic. So not a really big deal in terms of retrofitting in my yard. You don't have to dig up my whole yard to do that. Apparently it's not that simple. So when you get into these conversations with individual homes and individual property owners, it gets complicated really fast. Where's your septic system? How much light space do you have? What's on top of your septic system? Oh, you happen to plant, your gardens or your pathway adjacent to that. Do I really want to rip that out for some experimental system? I don't know. So getting these things approved in the field is proving to be challenging.
So just to cut to the end, when are these provisional systems going to be approved? When is there going to be 50 of them in the state that we can have some data?
I have no idea.
Hmm.
You got to find 50 takers. And then from the time you get your 50th taker, it's 3 more years until the state has sufficient data to review them and then come up with a decision. So at a minimum, if we were to get the 50th system in the ground today, you're 3 years away from having the data, plus the time for the bureaucracy to grind through the data to come up with a decision before you get an approval. And since, the one that I've heard people like the most, you're at 1, you still need 49 more, and then 3 years on top of that. So it's a while. And it's not a good answer for any of us who are sitting here trying to figure out what to do about these things.
That's what you're saying is very important. We had a forum in Wellfleet this week on the new septic systems, and Nitrex presented, and
Nitro.
yeah, Z Crocker, and
Yep.
also Brian Baumgartner.
Yep.
And I came away from that evening thinking, oh, the answer's here. It's 2-3 years and we're going to be installing these as the norm.
For nitrogen, maybe.
Yeah, but because phosphorus never came up.
Because the
Don, you were
whole
there.
focus of that conversation has been around getting Wellfleet Harbor and the Wellfleet Bay back into compliance with the TMDLs.
Right.
None of us on the Cape have been focused on lakes as anything other than potential nitrogen sinks to benefit the estuaries. No town has a comprehensive plan that is focused specifically on restoration or maintenance of lake water quality. It's all in relationship to the estuaries, and because it's in relationship to the estuaries, the phosphorus component does not have the importance that it needs in order to solve the problem facing the freshwater environments as resources of value in and of themselves.
That's thank you.
And I really wanted, if I wanted to make one point today, that was it.
Yeah, well, you just
That
did.
the conversation around alternatives and nitrogen control is relevant to, but not sufficient to solve the lake water quality challenges that we're all facing across all 15 towns.
Yeah.
I just found that email. Who should I send it to?
Send it to her.
Okay,
Yeah, I think you have my emails, you have my address.
I do.
Yeah. Yeah,
John, just,
All right, I just sent it and it's got a table of all the phosphorus control technologies and what the considerations are associated with retrofit or whether it requires a new system.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
John, one of the groups we could meet with here in Wellfleet is the wastewater committee. They're interested in this problem, and they have a lot of contacts. So that might be a way to move forward.
John, one of the questions we have to come back to later, and it's not, well, we're tying up these folks' time, is the boundaries of the estuary maps in Wellfleet do include only 3 of the ponds.
Mhm.
I think it's Duck, Long, and Great Pond. And the others, including Gull Pond, which does have the only feed directly into the bay, is not included in those maps. So it's what's being said here, that the consideration of ponds is altogether outside those limits for the most part. Oh my. The question is, could we switch for a minute and look at the list of what are the indicators of pond health that we should monitor, we should be sure are monitored. And I gave a list that the ones we've worked with in the past, which are water and air temperature, dissolved oxygen at different levels, clarity, now cyanobacteria levels, coliform, and aquatic vegetation. Can I ask, is that a list, Joanne, especially that we should be monitored, that should be monitored in all the ponds?
Yeah, I can address that question. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen again.
Please.
And thinking about this, you've got some of the, you can all see this, I assume. You've got some of the parameters of pond health that we recommend. Yes to all of the above, but there are some additional parameters that should be monitored. Total suspended solids that can be measured through a turbidity, which is another way of expressing clarity. pH, chlorophyll, which is a measure of phytoplankton, total phosphorus and total nitrogen. Whether you monitor aquatic vegetation depends on the state of the pond, whether you think it needs it, whether there are a lot of floating aquatic vegetation species present or not. You would want to monitor bacteria if there's a swimming beach, and Barnstable County monitors water quality of public swimming beaches. And cyanobacteria, of course, since we have a cyanobacteria monitoring program, and we look at the composition, that is the taxonomic composition, because it turns out that the genus of cyanobacteria present has implications for what type of toxin is produced, whether it's a neurotoxin or a liver toxin, and then the amounts of cyanobacteria and then toxins. So over the past 3 years, APCC developed a pond monitoring plan. It's a quality assurance project plan for the Cape Cod Commission through an EPA SNAP grant to the Cape Cod Commission to develop a regional water quality monitoring database. And that that quality assurance project plan was recently approved by EPA. And so I want to share the parameters that pond water quality monitoring quality assurance plan recommended. Temperature, water temperature, pH, conductivity, dissolved oxygen, water clarity, alkalinity, which is a different way of getting at the pH, but it's different. Total phosphorus, total nitrogen, if you can, nitrate and nitrite, and ammonia and orthophosphate, and chlorophyll and phaelophytin. Phaelophytin is a degradation product of chlorophyll. So if you measure chlorophyll and phaelophytin together, you get a total picture of the phytoplankton production. Whereas if you just measure chlorophyll, you're getting a measure of just the living phytoplankton present in the water column. With pH and alkalinity, pH is an important field measurement that you can get with a YSI meter, say a portable water quality probe. So is temperature, conductivity, and dissolved oxygen. pH in ponds in the Northeast in over the course of several decades had been getting more acidic due to sulfates in atmospheric deposition from coal plant use in the Midwest, believe it or not. But that has apparently been somewhat curtailed. And so we understand from Ivan Valiella, a scientist at MBL, that pond pH has actually been improving somewhat because of the lessening of coal burning fossil fuel plants and emissions of sulfate. So, but pH is important. Alkalinity is an important accompanying measurement, and it is actually a good measure, maybe even a better measure of the acidity of water. Dissolved oxygen, of course, is critically important for living creatures. If you had to economize on the cost of lab analyses for nutrients, for example, then I think we would recommend measuring at least total phosphorus and total nitrogen and leaving out the nitrate, nitrite, ammonium, and orthophosphate. But the ammonium is one compound that, as I mentioned before, if it's present, it's potentially harmful. So there's a long list here. It can be, it might seem kind of daunting. When you actually start comparing, and by the way, we worked on this plan with the Cape Cod Commission and the Center for Coastal Studies, which conducts both freshwater and marine water quality analyses. So their procedures are built into this pond water quality plan. When you start comparing costs from different labs to run these analyses, it turns out that the Center for Coastal Studies has a very cost-efficient costing scheme where they will monitor both total nitrogen and total phosphorus as part of one package, whereas with other labs, you'll sometimes have to pick each parameter separately and get a separate cost analysis. So there are some economies of scale to consider when you're actually thinking about trying to pay for a monitoring program, but those are the parameters that we recommend.
Ryan, can you address the frequency of testing?
Oh, yes.
Monitoring of this?
Frequency is at least for monitoring water quality, we would recommend at least monthly. I'm sorry, let me share my screen again. I think
Yes.
I've left it. We would recommend at least monthly during the growing season from April through October. And for cyanobacteria monitoring, because there's a really strong seasonal component, we conduct our monitoring biweekly, every 2 weeks, from May through October or November, depending on how long the cyanobacteria blooms are lasting. And we've been seeing blooms at some ponds as late as November. So that is typically for water quality, typically May, June, July, September are the usual months that other monitoring programs have used. For example, Division of Marine Fisheries does a very good water quality monitoring plan to look at pond water quality, same parameters pretty much, for suitability for juvenile herring habitat. And they monitor from May through September. The PALS program typically does a snapshot monitoring once in the late summer, once or twice in the late summer, August to September. And we feel that the snapshot method, while it's useful for giving preliminary information, is just not enough for characterizing what happens, what could happen during a pond, during the season, sorry. We recommend the growing season because that includes the hottest months of the year, when you could have the potentially the highest water temperatures, which can be, as climate change happens, you may see increasing water temperature, and with increasing water temperature, you may see lower dissolved oxygen, and those are critical parameters. If you have the resources, monitoring into the shoulder seasons can be interesting, but the fall and the cooler season, late fall, spring is when ponds tend to turn over. That is, the whole water column, or most of the water column can basically become much better mixed due to cold water sinking and causing it to turn over, and winds picking up and mixing it. So you'll get perhaps a different sense of the overall water quality of a pond if you monitor it during the winter when it's well mixed, versus monitoring during the growing season when you're basically looking at worst case conditions in terms of oxygen and temperature. I think, let's see, have I addressed that in gruesome detail?
You have,
Okay.
you have.
Joanne, Andrew, before we break up, I see that Suzanne Gropp Thomas, who is our beach administrator, has been listening to us, and I was just wondering if she wanted to ask any questions or make any comments.
Thank you, John. Apologize for the background because I'm at home today. I'm particularly interested in the testing, and I think that because our ponds are tested by the county for swimming quality, that we're getting a little complacent about the testing. I'd like to investigate ramping it up and obtaining funding for it.
Good point. Thank you.
Joanne and
I have, yeah, I have not looked into the frequency of county beach water quality testing in Wellfleet. Typically, it's my understanding that they do a weekly testing throughout the summer, but
That's correct.
June,
June-
right,
June to September.
June through September, exactly, right.
Mhm.
So, if you have questions about May and October, of course, you may want to consider it. It depends on the use of the ponds. If there's really heavy usage, or there's a history of E. coli or Enterococcus levels being exceeded at ponds during June, for example, you might want to consider backing up through May or whenever the ponds start getting used.
Thank you. Right now, we only have elevated levels at the swimming beaches following a heavy rainstorm.
Right, exactly.
So we have no real history of any June closings. Mostly it's July or August.
Okay. Well, I think you would want to think about what the risks are and the possible exposures. If you have more public use at some of these ponds ramping up during the late spring. I don't know how the beach use has been going historically, but I suspect that if you've got no June exceedances, that you're probably okay for now. But you've mentioned heavy rainstorms, and certainly number of public beaches become closed due to bacteria being detected or exceeding levels following heavy rainstorms. County comes out and retests. So when those beaches are safe again, but it also speaks to looking at stormwater runoff sources in your ponds. For example, if you've got boat ramps, I don't know if you do in Wellfleet, boat ramps or landings in ponds or heavy human use at some of these public beaches, you just might want to think about what the exposure, what the risks are.
Thank you.
And Joanne, thank you both. This has been an interesting discussion. I think probably what at least I have learned more is not the answers to questions, but what questions they should be asking. Joanne, you had a printed material you've been showing to us. Could you email that to me, because it has to be part of our minutes for this meeting. It's a public document.
Okay, yes, sure.
And I guess I would ask you and Andrew, anything you'd like to say in summarizing where we've got to, or
Other than,
suggestions for the future?
other than we'd just be happy to, assist you along the way. There's a lot of layers to this onion. So as you learn more and you generates more questions, feel free. We're happy to do this on a repeat basis as much as you need or want us to.
Thank you. That's a
Absolutely.
useful offer, which we're likely to pick up on.
Yes.
Good.
Joanne, we've covered every point, right? Just before we jump off.
I believe the only question that you hadn't really discussed was what are the most common or harmful invasive plants around
Yes.
pond
Yes,
margins?
if we just spend one moment on that.
I think what we would do, we would defer to the Cape Cod National Seashore, but in other ponds, and I'm sure this is the case in Wellfleet, I know from visiting some of the ponds in the Herring River watershed, Phragmites growth around the margins is certainly a major concern, and they're hard to eradicate once they're established. Purple loosestrife is another harmful invasive plant. I don't know how common it is in Wellfleet, but I've seen it in Truro in some wetlands and in not small quantities. I don't think it's as widespread throughout the Cape as it is on the North Shore, North Boston, where you see acres and acres of it sometimes in the marshes. but there are ways to control purple loosestrife using a beetle, which apparently works well. And then for other, certainly in the upland areas, where you want to preserve the native vegetation and the vegetative buffer, because the vegetative buffer to ponds helps to protect water quality by taking up nutrients. Where you have oriental bittersweet is a really, really invasive, difficult to eradicate non-native pest species. But otherwise, I think we would defer to the National Seashore in terms of specific species in ponds, around ponds, so forth.
I think the contact there, as you probably know, is Steve Smith.
Steve, right, exactly, right. Steve is their botanist and also studies ponds, right?
Herb, do you know Steve?
Yes, we've worked with them.
Okay, good.
We've worked with them for many years. And specifically on Phragmites, we have quite a serious outbreak on one pond, on Williams Pond. And the Seashore has been trying different methods of eradicating it. Unfortunately, the most effective was Roundup, glyphosate. Well, it's true, and that's no longer being used. I'm not sure what they're doing with it now. But yes, yeah, I've worked with Stephen for many years.
So this is, as I say, very helpful. I think the committee needs to move forward to a couple other issues. It won't take us long to deal with them. And I think we'll come back at our next meeting and try to put together what we've learned. Particularly would like to contact with the wastewater committee because they're looking at all sorts of alternatives. I think that would be helpful to get their chairman here. So, Andrew, John, thank you very much.
And yes, thank you so much.
I could see
Thank
you all.
you. Our
Thanks.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda was ATM issues. And what I heard at the select board meeting this past Tuesday is that the town meeting is going to be back to being a meeting in April. Standard issue. The financial experts in the town and got a lot of help from the state to resolve some of the issues. So the select board will be able to set a process for homeowner taxing, and that means that the money will start flowing in. The downside of this is that in terms of dealing with the Curly project, we won't be able to do anything until April. And I thought that one way we might get around that problem is to submit a request for proposals sometime this winter, review them, and then have the ATM vote be aye or nay about those specific proposals. Whether this is allowed or not, I have to talk with the town purchasing agent, Suzanne Slick. And I also have to talk to her about the proposals we had out for a dredging alternative. I don't know where that stands. I'm guessing that we may not have had much response, in which case we'll have to rethink that as well. So anyhow, let's begin to think about how we want to proceed for an April town meeting.
John, is that a question about whether it's procedurally proper to get
Yes,
a request? So you don't know whether we should be doing that, getting a request for a proposal?
it's a question of the procedure. Is the procedure I outlined allowed by town regulations? Looks logical to me, but logic doesn't always count.
Yeah, I mean, the question is how is it going to get funded? And, you know, so that's what everybody's going to want to know is where's the money going to come from? And
I think there would continue to be town support for the project if we go back with a good proposal. And I've thought of some additional ways that we could write the proposal that would be clearer to the voters what we're on about. But I'd like to discuss that more with you. I guess I have another question for you, John. How do you like them apples issue? I thought there was going to be some sort of general meeting at which we could express our opinions. It seems to have died and gone away.
Yeah, the Shellfish Advisory Board, I just talked to Becca, just texted her yesterday, and there is no meeting scheduled. And so we're still waiting. I guess what happened last time was the power outage. And so I don't know when the meeting will take place about that specific subject, but that's just a question. I have no idea when the next Shellfish Advisory Board meeting is. I talked a little bit with the Shellfish Department, Johnny and Nancy, about, Curly in general, about a harbor study in general. And of course, they're all behind a big shellfish study. And I asked them just to kind of take the temperature of the shellfishing community, because I'm not clear. I don't think anybody really knows about it. So there's definitely been a lack of awareness amongst people that were trying to do something in terms of a harbor study. So in terms of what would be involved in it, just like the original Curly report, it was heavily weighted towards shellfish. And as long as that was the case, I'm sure the shellfishing community would be behind it, but I shouldn't be sure, but that would be something we should think about doing a little bit of outreach on, see
Yes,
where they're at.
I agree. The name I kept dancing around, by the way, the head of the town wastewater team is Kurt Felix, and
Right.
I thought he might have been able to join this meeting because he is interested, but he would have links to people developing the new technology.
Yeah, that septic system, dealing with phosphorus, I didn't realize was something that was even, I thought I was fairly knowledgeable about septic systems, but I didn't know that there was a system that deals with phosphorus specifically by trapping it in the tank. And so I'm interested in knowing more about that. It sounds like it's so far up the road in terms of you need to have 50 of those systems installed statewide, and we don't even have one in yet. So I was interested in that, knowing more about that, because that's something that I think a lot of people, myself included, might be interested in upgrading. I was disappointed in the system that I paid a lot of money for. I think my number is 19 milligrams of nitrates that it gets it down to, which is not apparently a very low number. And it would be interested to see, but the problem I have is that there's just no room. I don't have any room And I don't know that many people that have room to put 2 septic systems in their property. Just in terms of a pilot study.
Andrew really popped my bubble on that. I was so enthused after the town forum, which never mentioned, the word phosphorus never came up in that.
Yeah,
discussion.
it's interesting. So I agree. I need to learn more about it. Kurt probably knows a lot about it. And,
Well, as they say,
yeah, I was,
going back to my ancient knowledge of chemistry, phosphorus should be a lot easier to deal with than nitrogen.
well, that's good to know.
Be-
We had naively thought that we had handled it when the town banned phosphates in detergents. We thought, okay, that's gone away. And it obviously hasn't. I remember when we're going back 10, 15 years when the push was on to not allow detergents with phosphates in them. And we thought that was a solution, which it wasn't. But the point that Andrew made, which comes through, which is going to make our pond management plan a little more complex, is that all the studies are on saltwater properly and payments are on saltwater. And there's been very little focus on ponds per se for their own health. That was a very interesting point he made about the interest in ponds being as nitrate sinks feeding saltwater. Whereas we're looking at ponds in and of themselves and maintaining the quality of the water in the ponds. And that's.
Yeah.
would be a
I was
stretch.
interested in what you said about the fact that Gull Pond being outside of the map of I didn't understand what you were saying there, but we do have a pond, Gull Pond, and that eventually drains down into the harbor. So there's one that affects saltwater embayments, and so
What I was referring to, I don't have the terminology down, was the map of Wellfleet that shows I think it's 7 or 8 different components of the sections of the estuary map. The estuary map is broken down into 7 or 8 different segments. One of them loops through Duck, I think it's Duck, Great, and Long Ponds, but none of them cover the Gull Pond chain. It just-
okay, that's something I don't understand why, and that's interesting. I don't know why that is, but
it's a sub question we'll have to address.
It may be, Herb, that what happens is that the groundwater flow, which starts up in the duck pond area, because that's the highest,
Yeah,
it goes down, it may then bend to the east. Because eventually the groundwater is trying to get the ocean one way or another, and it may bend to the east, and that as we know, the water from Gull Pond goes down the Herring River.
Yeah.
Which it will be interesting. There should be an increased flow when the Herring River restoration takes place, because the rate of flow depends on the change in the height, and at low harbor.
Yeah.
At low harbor tide, you can get a more rapid flow down the river. We just need to address some draft minutes from our meeting of October 13th. Are there any corrections, comments? Had a good discussion with Suzanne there.
no corrections.
Do I have if they're all right, may I have a motion to have them approved?
I make that motion. I move to approve the minutes.
Second,
Second, all in favor, just raise hands. Thank you very much. I'll see what we can set up. I'll be very interested to look more carefully at what Joanne is going to send us and then use that as a basis for the next meeting. I think, maybe we can do something almost in cooperation with the wastewater committee.
What Joanne did was take the email I sent to her with the agenda,
Yeah, and I saw that,
with her data, which was wonderful.
yeah,
I have to get back to her and really thank her for, she put a lot of work into that. She took that paper and the agenda we drew up and wrote down her answers. Terrific.
Thanks for setting it up, Herb. They were really great.
Yeah, well, it seemed to have helped.
Yeah,
We
Herb,
could
if
have
I
been
could
on the
ask-
phone all morning.
If I could ask you to forward the, that stuff that Andrew sent you on the septic, that'd be great.
Yes, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Why don't what's the best way of doing that, Joyce?
Just send it to all of us, I guess, you know?
No,
yeah, just,
let me make sure I have it while
okay. Enjoy your weekends, guys.
You
And
too.
thank you for helping to organize a good meeting.
thank you.
So meeting is adjourned.
All right,
See y'all.
you know, have a good weekend, everybody.